It's 1982 AD, year 12 of the global fiat era, and 26 years before contact with Bitcoin. Blade Runner, E.T., Tron, and Star Trek II win in the box office, and so does Grease. Michael Jackson's Thriller album is released, but the world will have to wait another year to discover the moonwalk. Eye of the Tiger and I Love Rock and Roll top the charts, while the not even one-year-old MTV promises to revolutionize the music industry through music videos. Meanwhile, following the previous year's assassination attempt on his life, Ronald Reagan's presidency is overseeing a drop in inflation to only 6.2%, down from 10.4% the year before, and interest rates have tumbled from 15.8% to only 11.5%. The average new car costs under $8,000, and the median home price is under $68,000. Median income is $20,000 a year. The latest gadget, a Commodore VIC-20, costs $300, and a huge, top-of-the-line, state-of-the-art 19-inch Sony Trinitron Color TV costs $500. And, for the first time ever, Time's Man of the Year is an inanimate object, the computer.
So this is the first of our Time Machine panels. We're doing 4 of them, 10 years apart. Each one will have a fun video like that. And what we're trying to do is connect history to the present and go all the way back to 1982 for this first one. And we've got panelists on each one of these that are going to talk about economy, technology, and culture. And I'll start with you, Jeff, talking about the economy in the 1980s. What do you remember of those times then? What were people predicting? What led to Reagan getting elected in office just the prior year?
First of all, good morning, everybody. Thanks for having me. Great to see everyone. Now to that question, I was 12. So I don't know if I can really remember. Here's what I do remember. Interest rates were really high going into the 80s. My family had a whole bunch of real estate. And then when interest rates went up, my family levered into real estate. And when interest rates went up, the whole real estate fell, and we were left on the other side of that with almost nothing. And so, actually, funny enough for me, it was one of those, what happened, and later on in life, what happened to create that cycle, and what does that look like? How does that relate to today? Well, what you realize is the debt has to, when the government, at that time, Volcker, by increasing interest rates, government debt was only about 30% of GDP. So he could increase interest rates and cause a collapse in the economy. But as a collapse in the economy happened, then government debt has to expand to absorb the collapse because there's a whole bunch of people out of work. And so essentially you've moved the debt from the private market to the public market. And today, why that's so different today, so you could solve that problem in 82 by moving that problem to the government debt. But today, where it's so different is today government debt is 130% of GDP. And so you cannot collapse the economy and absorb it into government debt. You have to monetize it differently. So very different time. And so people that believe that you can do the same thing today are misguided. It's very different today.
Okay. All right. Let's turn to technology, Bob. The IBM personal computer had just been released. We didn't have the Mac yet or anything like that. Everyone sensed something big was coming with computers. We'll talk about that in the culture in a minute. What do you remember of those times? What were people thinking of computers, and what were their interactions?
Bitcoin is for everyone. Well, I think in that era, nobody knew what revolution was about to occur, or that was actually already underway. I think that what we can see in hindsight now is that the personal computer was the decentralization of computing power itself, and that this wave that was about to come from the internet and us sitting here today with Bitcoin really, I think, had a genesis point right there. Because prior to that point, computing was done in rooms, you went to terminals, you had to do those sort of things. And as an example of that, for instance, in 1982, that was the year I graduated from high school, and I had a Commodore VIC-20. I had some programming skills, and I got hired by a local bank to write an amortization schedule for that computer. And the computer cost $300. The program that I wrote, I charged them $3,000 for. And it's really a pretty simple function if you think about it, writing an amortization schedule. But what you might not realize is that I had to write things like the print driver. Like I had to figure out where to put a 5 on the piece of paper. And so all these things weren't kind of part of the standard. And what the IBM PC did is it removed the ability or removed the need for people to have those abilities at that level and let people just start kind of moving toward running software. And of course, we needed WordStar and we needed VisiCalc and we needed some of those early software programs. VisiCalc, by the way, was a predecessor to Lotus 1-2-3, which was a predecessor to Excel. But that decentralization, I think, was a pinnacle point. And I think Time really got it right when they named the personal computer, I guess, the machine of the year.
That's great. We'll turn to you, Pete, and talk a little bit about the culture. It was a very optimistic culture, despite having come off of a recession. We had Grease, Michael Jackson's Thriller, Family Ties, so very family friendly. But there was also, I'll ask you secondarily about how technology was impacting the culture. But what is your study of what 1982 was like culturally?
Well, first off, I'll say I'm the only one on the panel who wasn't born at that time, but I do spend a lot of my times in the archives looking at that part of history from the lens of Bitcoin. And I do think it's pretty fascinating. One, this is kind of the genesis of starting the decentralization of the internet, it moving from something that was the domain of college campuses, that was really done by institutions, to something that was done by people. So that's something that's fascinating to me. And then also just that, the nature of computers was starting to change, where hardware and software was separating, right? So you have the genesis of the free software movement, which becomes the open source movement, which, of course, Bitcoin, everybody knows, is open source. So you really do have some of the seeds of, things that are very important to us as Bitcoiners today start happening in the late 80s. Obviously wasn't there. I think I was mostly into Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles later. That was kind of where I come into the picture.
Great. I guess back to economics, Jeff. We'd seen gas prices quadruple in a decade. Food prices were really high. Very similar picture to now. I guess this is maybe too similar to the question I was asking before. We saw a lot. We didn't see the gloom back then. And if that's too similar to the question I asked you before, maybe we could expand on what fundamentally was happening in the economy that was leading to the recovery that we were seeing.
Yeah, fundamentally, what Reagan and Volcker did worked. Now, you collapsed a whole bunch of economy and it created a huge hardship on many companies as they went broke. As when I talk about my family, we went broke through it. But on the other side of that, or for the people that could hang on, now you could rebuild. Now, to do that, you had to move debt to the government level, and that's not, you can't do that anymore. Like raising interest rates at that level today puts the government in a debt spiral. And that debt spiral means, like today when you look at that, today Treasury numbers or Fed numbers predict next year a $2 trillion deficit. And I would take the under on that. It's going to be a lot bigger than that, because what's ends up happening as the businesses start to fail and unemployment goes up, they're not projecting that the lower tax income from that in their spending forecast, and it starts to roll over. So the amount of debt, or the amount of, now you could say, manipulation of money that is required to be able to offset that, there's just no other way. You just can't, you can't tighten without a collapse of the entire system. So I think today, added to where we are in technology, more people are aware, right? In 1982, it was really hard to figure out what we're talking about. Today you have global communication, and and billions of minds contributing to the conversation, that it's impossible to hide from the true nature of the truth in there. So there's just no way to manipulate and say, it's this reason and get a whole society to believe that, because people can see through it, because we have global communication that is seamless.
Yeah, thinking about globalism, back then, manufacturing was still basically based in North America, right? We hadn't seen the globalization. China wasn't much of an economic power at all, really. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about how that led to the recovery or the optimism, because doesn't some of the dread now come from the fact that we don't know what to do with ourselves because we don't have the manufacturing base here. We're not the economic superpower that we used to be.
Yeah, and this leads to the Triffin dilemma. This is why a currency you have to have a neutral reserve currency for the world to work. For the U.S. to work for a long time, the U.S. benefited by having the world reserve currency. But that benefit comes with that exorbitant privilege comes with a huge cost. Because other countries need to be there, all over the world, you have to have essentially global trade is a zero-sum game. You have to have buyers and sellers. And as other currencies, as U.S. dollar gets stronger, and other currencies are weaker in balance, it means U.S. is the only consumer of the world, and everybody else becomes sellers to the world. And that means high labor rates and high debt rates to be able to be the only consumer. It means everybody else is essentially funding with vendor financing. And ultimately what that drives is there's just no economic way for production to move back to the US with that imbalance. And so now that production it creates the entire military industrial complex, or the entire offshoring of everything is a function. And now you lead into security concerns for the US as well. And that has to change. That will change no matter what. Bitcoin is that path to that change. But this has been going on for a long time, and what helped the US for a long time actually now hurts the US. And so the US needs it as bad as anybody else.
Yeah, it was really the beginning of globalization back then. And like we all drove American cars, right? It was very rare to see a European car, and there were no Korean cars at the time. Did you?
If I can add, I think that certainly the Triffin dilemma was like a big part of this, but I think we were talking a little backstage about complacency. When you reach the pinnacle of something, sometimes you get complacent, and I think American manufacturing and American ingenuity hit a point where a lot of that was going away, especially outside of Silicon Valley. And so I was born and raised in a town called Kenosha, Wisconsin, which until the riots of a couple years ago was famous for making the Pacer. And you just saw that the quality of the cars changed. There was an inflection point right around there where suddenly owning a Toyota or a Nissan was not frowned upon. It was not looked at. And so we saw that manufacturing base. I think a lot of that was because of the implementation of technology. These other places were putting quality criteria and technology into play, and exacerbated by the cost issue from the Triffin dilemma.
Right. Pete, I want to ask you about technology and culture at the time. Like we saw in the trailer, in the video up front, a couple of the biggest movies were about technology and kind of the fearfulness of it. There was Blade Runner, which was forecasting a world where a cyberpunk future where robots were wandering around and the hero had to hunt them down and kill them. And Tron was a movie where the hero got sucked in to the...
Yeah, I can jump in there, and you really did see, I think, reading through the cypherpunk mailing list, that there was this big convergence between storytelling, traditional art and books, and science fiction and the cypherpunks. And so people might not know, but one of the big inspirations for Hal Finney was, reading science fiction, right? And as he was thinking about digital cash, digital identity, one of his favorite books was this book called True Names. And it, prophesizes this future society in which to be anonymous is under threat, right? Essentially that governments are already kind of using databases, right? These kind of new technologies to start tracking citizens. And what's very interesting is in a lot of these stories, the technologist is on the side of good, right? Restoring freedoms to the people, and the state kind of emerges as this, villain, right? Kind of in these stories. And I think, you can very much still see that this is the Bitcoin story today, right? Bitcoin is trying to restore money to the people out of the hands of the government databases, but it has these roots in this old storytelling and in these old books, and some of them are quite fascinating if you have a chance to read them.
And also in the culture, I think we saw technology working its way into things like music. It was the year that MTV launched, so music was becoming visual. And we were talking backstage about like synthesizers entering music. It was becoming electronic.
Well, the synthesizer is, if you understand musical history, most musical instruments prior to the synthesizer are non-digital, right? They're actually working with string vibrations, the bass guitar, the classical guitar. And the synthesizer really comes in the 80s and is the first digital instrument, right? You can computerize sound. You can take something, move it into the digital sphere and then start experimenting with it, right? So you think of 80s, it's a new wave, and you really start to see that synth becomes, kind of a dominant part of the culture, and then still today.
And Bob, this was the beginning of Silicon Valley as the digital hub of the world, and while the world was globalizing to manufacture other things, America was becoming the technological powerhouse of the world, because I think you were saying the decentralization of the computer, the IBM computer being the decentralized thing and being a platform rather than a proprietary thing of IBM's. What was it like in '82 and the first few following years in terms of seeing technology rising and becoming the hope of America's productive engine?
Well, I think the PC became the platform upon which innovation could occur, right? So we don't have the internet, at least the internet as we know it today, without the personal computer. And I know Jeff, works a lot in like layer 2 and layer 3 of Bitcoin. Well, I think you could think of the PC as kind of the base layer, and then maybe the internet as the second layer, and then
well, even the telephone lines below that, right?
Excuse me?
You're using the telephone line infrastructure below that even, right?
Yeah. And so I think it just became this, and it empowered people. A guy in his garage could actually do something now. A person in their bedroom could start writing code. That's really what changed the world. That's what the PC enabled, because until then, it was guys in Bell Labs and in fancy lab coats doing this stuff, and now it was us.
So it was a democratization of access to technology. Things were going from the lab to the garage, and this was really the beginning of that moment. I'm wondering, Jeff, I've lost my train of thought. As the technology was coming up and coming in, what that meant for the economy, right? Like, what did that mean? How was that going to start transforming the economy and setting up a battle between technology and everything that it was disrupting?
That's creative destruction, right? And typically a monopoly, whether that monopoly is in money or a monopoly is in a business, a monopoly cannot see the creative destruction that technology allows, because technology enables the people that are most hurt by the monopoly. And so that's what's happening today in money. But if you look at why effectively IBM lost the personal computer is because of that same thing. It enables what Bob was talking about. It allows millions of other minds to come on and create something totally different that destroys the monopoly. Even if the monopoly could see it, they're designed differently, and all their people are trying to protect their monopoly. For the same reason Kodak invents the digital camera and fails in it. So this is throughout time, and what you have is typically one giant centralization trend, and as that central power gets too big, it has to hurt other people, and it gives less value, and technology changes the rule and distributes that to more minds that solve a problem in a different way. That's just how society's built. In fact, if you go look back in 82, if you go back to 82 and put yourself there for people who were alive there, if you looked at the technology we take for granted today, it would seem like magic. And it all came from just entrepreneurs' ideas, individual ideas, creating things that drove value for other people, that then caught fire, and we use the things that created value. And so it's just a really natural process, and is actually why Bitcoin's inevitable anyways, because now you're doing that on a new layer. You're building a new peer-to-peer internet that's empowering anybody to build on top of it, that has a base layer that's secure. So it's super exciting where we're going. But again, if you just look at the long arc of technology, it's unstoppable.
Bob, with the technology at the time, what were people thinking was the next big thing? Like, they weren't thinking Bitcoin yet, right? They weren't thinking we're going to have digital, decentralized network money. They weren't even really networked together. What do you remember people were excited about that they already were just getting their hands on or were expecting to see?
Yeah, it certainly didn't envision the internet, that's for sure. The vision of networks being important was there. Yeah. And so things like LAN parties would actually occur. So geeky people like me would take their desktop computer and go into a room with a bunch of other people, and we would connect over a LAN, and we'd play games, and we'd do things like that. And I think we saw some of the power that would come from that. But it was, by the way, it was temporary, because we would all pack up and go home later on. But we started to see that. I think probably the thing that was probably most at the forefront of people's mind was email, though. And that method of communication was changing. I happened to graduate in high school in 1982. By 1986, when I entered kind of the formal workforce out of school, there had already been a change where the standard memo, so it used to be you would get a memo that would be sitting on your desk, and that started to change where you didn't get memos, you started to get an email, like, hey, there's a meeting, or Friday's Jeans Day, or you'd get those kind of messages. So we were just at that precipice of kind of seeing over the horizon, but we honestly didn't really know.
I guess, Pete, last question to you. The technology was starting to affect entertainment in the sense of we were starting to see interactive entertainment. There were the first arcade games. We'd gone past pinball, and we had video games.
I would just add what you were saying about people maybe not foreseeing the time. There were some who did, right? And really, we do see the first writing on digital cash from this period, and David Chaum kind of coming out and really envisioning what these systems could be like. So it just kind of goes to show how long kind of some of these movements take, right? Visa and MasterCard were emerging around this time. There was already a sense, even in the 80s, that this was going to be a problem, that we couldn't have online payments with this infrastructure. So I guess I would just say, there might be some thinkers out there today who are thinking 30 years in the future, and that's what the past shows us, right?
Just really quickly, even then, the movies that were out predicted two different outcomes, or the two shows, and you had Star Trek that talked about a world where the technology abundance was distributed to everybody. That would look like a Bitcoin world, and you had Star Wars, where you had an evil empire. That's really kind of what you're looking at today in the fight over money.
That's terrific. Did you want to say one last thing? We got 10 more seconds. Okay.
15 seconds.
Well, listen, thanks everybody. We'll bring up the next set of speakers. We'll see you again later.